Somewhere in the Arizona desert, whole bombers lie sawed into 5 pieces, wings severed from fuselage, tails set at a precise angle, arranged deliberately so an enemy's satellites could photograph the corpses and confirm the kills. These were B-52 Stratofortresses, nuclear machines that cost tens of millions each, part of a stored fleet valued at more than $34 billion. Some flew combat over Vietnam for 30 years. Then America chopped them apart with a 13,000-pound blade and sold them for 12 cents a pound. Why would the strongest air force in history execute its own bombers in the open? But before it was a graveyard, it was a promise. Roll back to 1919. The Tucson Chamber of Commerce opens the nation's first municipally owned airfield on a dusty strip where the rodeo grounds sit today. 8 years later, they move it southeast of town and dedicate it Davis-Monthan Field, for a while, the largest municipal airport in the United States. The name already carried 2 dead men. Lieutenant Samuel Davis, killed in a Florida crash in 1921, and Lieutenant Oscar Monthan, an aeronautical engineer killed in a bomber crash in Hawaii in 1924. 2 local aviators, both dead in machines, and their names went over the gate before a single plane was buried there. On September 23, 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew in fresh from crossing the Atlantic and dedicated the field. The city handed him a replica of the Spirit of St. Louis, built out of Ocotillo cactus. An Army sergeant named Simpson set up a fuel and service operation and kept a logbook of everyone who landed to refuel: Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, Jimmy Doolittle, Benjamin Foulois. For a few years, this was the glamorous edge of American aviation, a place where the famous stopped for gas in the desert. What made Tucson perfect for glamour also made it perfect for something colder. The air here holds 10 to 20% humidity. Rain barely reaches 11 inches a year. The field sits at 2,500 feet, and under the thin soil is caliche, a hardpan so dense you can park a 40-ton bomber on bare ground without laying a foot of pavement. Steel that would rot away on a coastal base in a decade can sit here for half a century and barely bleed rust. The desert doesn't just tolerate airplanes, it preserves them. That mattered enormously in 1945 because the country had just won a war and suddenly owned tens of thousands of aircraft it no longer needed. You cannot leave a superfortress out in the rain in Ohio, but you can lay it in the Arizona dirt and walk away. By May 1946, more than 600 B-29 superfortresses and 200 C-47 Skytrains had been flown or trucked to Davis-Monthan. In September of that year, Lieutenant Colonel R. Frank Shermer took command of a new unit with a bureaucratic name, the 4,105th Army Air Force's Base Unit, Aircraft Storage. His job was simple and strange: keep an Air Force asleep. Shermer's crews mummified them. Each B-29 was sprayed with 4 layers of plastic in 4 colors: yellow, then red, then black, then a final coat of heat-reflecting aluminum, sealing the aircraft against dust and sun. By 1947, they had cocooned 479 of them. Picture it: rows of silver-skinned bombers lying in the heat like insects in amber, an entire wartime fleet embalmed and waiting. Waiting for what? Nobody could quite say. That was the whole idea. You didn't scrap a bomber that cost a fortune to build. You put it in the desert bank and hoped you'd never make a withdrawal. And there it is, the contradiction that would run through everything this place became. A facility built to save airplanes only fills up when America decides its machines are finished. Every jet that lands here is a small obituary for a strategy that stopped working. The Boneyard grows on defeat, not victory. Its inventory is a running tally of everything the Pentagon has given up on. For a moment, it looked like the machines might wake up. In 1948, when the Soviets blockaded Berlin, about a quarter of those stored C-47s were pulled back out of the desert and flown to Germany to help feed a trapped city. The savings account paid out. It set the Cold War pattern: Keep everything, throw away nothing, because the next emergency was always one blockade away. Strategic Air Command moved in. The B-29s gave way to B-50s, and in 1949 one of them, Lucky Lady 2, left this desert and flew around the world non-stop, 23,452 miles in 94 hours, refueled 4 times in the air. Davis-Monthan wasn't just where old planes went to die. For a while, it was where the future of air power took off. But the fleet in the dirt kept growing, and the bigger it got, the more it started to look less like a bank and more like a mirror the Air Force didn't want to look into. By the mid-1950s, the pattern had a rhythm, and the rhythm had a sound. The whine of engines being cut, the clank of parts coming off, the low grind of scrapping saws. The desert bank kept taking deposits, and some of them were enormous. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker was the largest bomber America ever built, a 6-engine intercontinental giant meant to carry the atomic bomb across oceans. It was obsolete almost the moment the jet age arrived. Starting in 1956, they hauled the Peacemakers to Tucson and took them apart. 384 of them were dismantled and melted down. 4 survived, saved for museums. The rest became aluminum ingots, a weapon called Peacemaker, cut up in the piece. That was the machine finding its true purpose. This was not a museum. It was a processing plant for the end of things, a place that turned yesterday's national priorities back into raw metal and pulled the still useful organs out of the dead to keep the living flying. In 1965, the operation nearly doubled. The Pentagon shut its aircraft storage yard at Litchfield Park near Phoenix and consolidated the Navy's surplus fleet into Davis-Monthan. Rather than fly the planes, uncocoon them, and reseal them, they mostly trucked them across the state. Cheaper that way. The renamed outfit became the Military Aircraft Storage and Disposition Center, a joint operation now swallowing the discards of the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, and NASA. 1 yard in 1 desert, receiving the leftovers of the entire American air arsenal. Walk it at its peak, and the scale stops making sense. 2,600 acres of aircraft, laid out in numbered grid rows like a city with no people. The official valuation became a slogan: America's National Air Power Reservoir, more than $34 billion in stored aircraft, a savings account the Air Force could raid for parts or whole planes. On a typical day, the inventory ran past 4,000 aircraft. The counts fluctuate, and a line-by-line list from March 2025 tallied around 3,200, while other figures push near 5,000, depending on what you count as an airplane. Alongside them sat roughly 6,500 aircraft engines on racks, a warehouse of hearts waiting for bodies. And here's the detail that ought to stop you. The largest air fleet on Earth is run by about 550 people, almost all of them civilians. Not soldiers, not pilots. Tow tug drivers, sealant sprayers, sheet metal workers, parts pullers, a blue-collar workforce in the Tucson sun, quietly managing more airframes than most nations have ever owned. You can see their work in the process itself. A retired jet flies in and goes first to the wash rack, where crews strip it of fuel, explosives, and classified gear. Then comes the spray seal, a white latex compound painted over the canopy and every opening, reflecting the sun and sealing the interior against the desert. Row after row of parked fighters end up with those blank white eyes, cockpits sealed like closed lids. The planes don't look dead, they look asleep. That was the point. Some were kept in near-flyable condition, ready to be recalled. Others were hulks, tagged as organ donors from the day they landed. Robert Rain, a retired naval officer who became the yard's public voice, would explain the logic plainly. The environment reduces rust, the hard soil lets them move aircraft without paving, and the reservoir saves the taxpayer real money. In a single recent year, crews reclaimed nearly 7,000 parts, a cost avoidance of more than 1/3 of $1 billion. Every hatch, rib, and circuit card pulled off a dead jet was a part the Air Force didn't have to buy. For decades, that was the whole story Tucson told about the Boneyard. Clever, thrifty, a little eerie, mostly a marvel. Tour buses started rolling through. Aviation buffs lined up to photograph the endless rows. The place became a spectacle, a bucket list stop, the world's largest airplane graveyard sold as a wonder rather than a warning. But look again at what was actually happening out there. Every jet in those grids arrived because a mission ended. The B-29s came from a war that was over. The B-36s came from a strategy that failed. The Navy planes came from a base that got closed. This wasn't a monument to air power. It was a ledger of everything America had built, believed in, and then decided it no longer wanted. And the ledger only ever grew longer. The confidence held because the machine looked permanent and profitable. Nobody in the rows was asking the darker question. What happens when the thing that fills this desert isn't obsolescence or thrift, but a treaty that orders you to destroy your own weapons where your enemy can watch? What happens when the chemicals that keep these aircraft sleeping start showing up in the water under the city? The answer was already seeping into the ground. It just hadn't surfaced yet. The treaty came in 1991. On July 31st, George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev signed START 1, the most ambitious nuclear arms cut in history, capping each side's bombers and warheads. For the United States, it meant killing off a chunk of the B-52 fleet. And the treaty had one brutal condition. The destruction had to be verifiable. You couldn't quietly mothball the bombers. You couldn't tuck them in the desert to sleep. The other side had to be able to see them die. So Davis-Monthan built a guillotine. A 13,000-pound steel blade was hoisted on a crane over the tail of a B-52, then dropped. It fell 4 times on each aircraft, severing the wings, cutting the fuselage into 5 clean pieces. Roughly 365 bombers went under it. Some accounts say closer to 375. These were airframes that had cost tens of millions, machines crews had babied for 3 decades, planes that had flown over Vietnam and stood nuclear alert against the very country now watching them fall. And that was the strangest part. The severed pieces were left out in the open desert, arranged deliberately for at least 2 to 3 months, so Russian reconnaissance satellites passing overhead could photograph the wreckage and confirm the kills. Wings here, fuselage there, tail angled just so, a slaughterhouse staged for an orbiting camera. Only after the enemy had counted the dead were the remains sold for scrap at about 12 cents a pound. The war ended, and America chopped up its own bombers so the losing side could watch. That is the image from the beginning of this story. Now you know what it cost. The survivors got a different sentence. Retired F-16 aircraft were regenerated, made flyable again, and converted into QF-16 target drones, zombie vipers, the crews called them, because they raised dead fighters just to shoot them down. Radar and guns stripped out, ballast bolted in, a self-destruct charge installed, maybe 300 flight hours of life left before a missile finds them. In November 2025, the last one, the 127th, an old F-16 that once flew for the North Dakota Air National Guard's Happy Hooligans, lifted off from the Boneyard, its faded home unit marking still visible, headed out to be destroyed on a range, reborn to die on schedule. But the machines were only half the reckoning. The other half was in the water. For decades, aviation solvents, degreasers, and firefighting foam soaked into the ground around this field and the industry that grew up beside it. Underneath Tucson's south side, a working-class, largely Latino community, a plume of trichloroethylene, TCE, spread nearly 4 miles through the aquifer, far past the federal safety limit of 5 micrograms per liter. Much of that older contamination traces to the Hughes plant and the airport area complex, not the Boneyard alone. But the base is part of the same machine, and its more recent legacy, PFAS, the forever chemicals in firefighting foam from Davis-Monthan and the neighboring Air National Guard base, shut down around 18 to 20 of Tucson's backup wells, disconnected in 2018 and still spreading. In 1985, an Arizona Daily Star reporter named Jane Kay documented unusually high rates of cancers and birth defects among residents living over the plume. That same year, a woman named Rose Marie Augustine founded Tucsonans for a clean environment, refusing to let the neighborhood be treated as acceptable collateral for national defense. Lawsuits followed, settlements in the tens of millions. A treatment plant called TARP has pumped and scrubbed the aquifer since 1994. Nearly 48 billion gallons of groundwater processed, more than 5,000 pounds of TCE stripped out, and running still because the cleanup isn't a fix. It's a permanent condition. Here is the final irony, and it flies overhead every day. The base's own combat wing, the 355th, flies the A-10 Thunderbolt, and the A-10 is being retired, which means A-10 aircraft now taxi off the active flight line and roll straight into the grid rows, buried on the same field they launched from. The killing force isn't a foreign enemy. It's a budget line, a treaty clause, a strategy that moved on. It always was. Today, the tour buses still roll through, and visitors still photograph the endless silver rows, calling it a wonder. Most of them never drive to the south side, never see the capped wells or the treatment plant humming away. They see the sleeping fleet. They miss the poisoned water and the sawn-apart bombers that made this place what it is. The spirit of St. Louis came here out of cactus, and the desert has been keeping America's flying machines ever since. Some it preserves, some it feeds to the next war as targets, and some it laid open to the sky, in pieces, for the enemy to count. The planes are gone. The desert kept the evidence.